And the beginning of this one, I said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "I want to ride a motorcycle off a cliff." "What do you want to do?" I was like, "I want to wreck a train." Then there were times when we were on set and Tom would look at me and he'd say, "This was your idea, just remember that." We developed a motto on this movie: "That's a terrible idea, when do we start?"
So I know it's been quite some time since Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning came out, but with the new one finally releasing next year, I thought it might be worth revisiting. And it's just as miserable as I remember. Now, it's no real secret how the most recent Mission Impossible films are made. Rather than starting with a script, director Christopher McQuarrie and leading man Tom Cruise actually pieced the story together as they film.
This movie started without a screenplay.
Well, the way we made this film, we didn't really have a script as such.
I've never sat down and read the screenplay from beginning to end. It never existed in that form until the movie was finished.
To make this a bit easier, they pick the locations, the action, and the stunts they want to include, and then build the story around these elements. Now, typically when I hear filmmakers proudly talking about how little time there was to write their film or how they came up with the script whilst they were shooting, I often go and see the film and think, yeah, I can tell. But the thing is, it's hard to criticize this run and gun strategy of filmmaking when the final product is actually good. It's probably not necessarily the best way to go about doing things, but at the end of the day, all that matters is the quality of the film or show that is released. And with Rogue Nation and Fallout, it really seemed like they had it nailed. However, last year when I left the theatre after watching Dead Reckoning for the first time, I couldn't help but feel that it had been incredibly disappointing. The film felt awkwardly stitched together in a way the previous films had not. Like the strategy of filmmaking they typically adopt hadn't paid off. Rather than the film coming together cohesively, it felt like a collection of set pieces with little thought as to how they logically fit together in the story, jumping from one location and action sequence to the next, with little to no rhyme or reason. And what I think exemplifies this perfectly is the central stunt within the film, the bike jump. Before the film even came out, the bike jump was heavily showcased in the marketing of the film, to the point where they practically showed the stunt in its entirety a whole 7 months before the film's theatrical release. With so much attention being drawn towards it, I couldn't help but wonder how exactly this stunt was going to fit into the story. By McQuarrie's own admission,
The action is never the hard part, it's the reasons. Reasons are hard.
and in Dead Reckoning, that couldn't be more evident. If we take a closer look, the stunt fails on 3 levels. The setup is poor, the action is underwhelming, and the aftermath of it all is absurd. Yet they managed to deliver on all 3 fronts in Mission Impossible Fallout, building action set pieces with solid foundations that actually offered substance beyond the spectacle. So how exactly did they fumble the bag with Dead Reckoning so massively? Well, why don't we just take a look? One of the most important aspects of an action sequence is the way in which it justifies its presence within the plot of the film. The setup is incredibly important, yet Dead Reckoning fails to provide meaningful justification for the bike stunt. Now, this setup for the stunt really begins in the mission briefing scene before the train sequence. Up to this point, Ethan and the team have been in a global race to acquire 2 halves of a cruciform key that unlocks the entity, a sentient artificial intelligence with unlimited computational power and the capacity to infiltrate all domains of the digital world. So naturally, everyone wants to gain control of the entity by obtaining the key, whilst Ethan wants to destroy it.
No one should be trusted with control of the entity. I mean to kill it.
We've met Grace, a professional thief, and we've lost Ilsa in a way that feels completely disrespectful to her as a character. She should have absolutely won her fight against Gabriel, purely because she is afforded the advantage with the longer reach of the sword. But instead, she repeatedly tries to grapple and get in close. She fights as if she wants to die, and she does, in a manner that is a complete waste of her character. But fuck it, I guess. It's all about Grace now. Anyways, with one half of the key currently in their possession, the team start to formulate a plan to obtain the other half. From the evening before at the Ducali Palace, they know the White Widow has this half and plans to deliver the completed key to a third party.
In a little over 3 hours, the White Widow is expected to be on the Orient Express to Innsbruck.
But the thing is, the White Widow doesn't have the completed key, yet she's still planning on proceeding to the transaction with no alternative plan.
How are you going to do that?
Nevertheless, the team know they need a plan to make their way onto the train to obtain the White Widow's half of the key. It is here we learn for the first time in the Mission Impossible franchise that all IMF agents were apparently criminals in their past, and when caught were given the choice of prison, death, or to join and commit themselves to the IMF.
Your future boils down to 3 options now.
Prison? Death?
Or the choice?
At one time or another, each of us was in a similar situation to yours.
And each of us was offered the choice.
What the fuck?
This strikes me as odd, considering this concept is entirely invented for this film and completely contradicts events that have taken place in prior films. For one, in Rogue Nation, the first film McQuarrie wrote in this franchise, Benji makes a comment that comes across as if the IMF was advertised to him.
Join the IMF. See the world on a monitor. In a closet.
So the fact that he's claiming in Dead Reckoning that he was given the choice is a complete lie, as it wouldn't have been presented to him in this manner. I guess McQuarrie either just forgot or didn't care about what had come before.
You had one job. Just the one?
And on the notion that you have to commit yourself once you join, well, that simply isn't true either. Remember in MI3 when Ethan was allowed to retire from the IMF, or even in Rogue Nation when Benji transferred to the CIA and Luther resigned from the IMF.
All I know about you is that you chose to work for Hunley.
Yeah, all I know about you is you chose to resign.
I suppose the choice of dedicating yourself to the IMF isn't as concrete as they make it seem. On top of this, the IMF is retconned into somewhat of a suicide squad. But what exactly do I mean by this? If you're not familiar with the Suicide Squad, they're basically a group of convicts that are offered the choice to join a task force and endanger their own lives in exchange for less prison time, which is basically what the IMF has become in Dead Reckoning. But instead of less prison time, they just avoid prison completely. Why McQuarrie thought this was necessary is beyond me, as this just doesn't line up with previous films in the franchise and almost feels as if the events of this film exist in a completely different universe to the one we've been following.
Hit that director in the face really fucking hard.
And this isn't even taking into account the fact that entrusting criminals with this level of security clearance is completely irresponsible. It's no wonder they're always going rogue.
He always goes rogue. Him and his merry pack of prankster circus freaks. That's all they do.
So anyways, Grace obviously chooses the option to join the IMF because it's not really much of a choice, and with her on board, the plan is laid out. With Grace impersonating the White Widow and Ethan impersonating her brother Zola, the two will make their way onto the train. How exactly? Well, as Benji outlines a bit later, it seems like the plan was just to waltz right on at the station.
That's not an option. They're going to be looking for Ethan and Grace at the station. That mask was his ticket onto the train.
But how would that event actually play out? We find out a bit later that Zola has a plan in place to locate Grace and obtain the other half of the key.
We have informants covering the airport, the train station, and the waterways. Grace isn't getting out of Venice without our knowing it.
So there would have to be some sort of security at the train station on the lookout for anything amiss. Security that would be competent enough to notice two versions of the same person getting on the train wearing completely different outfits. There is absolutely no way this plan works, and you wouldn't be able to just sneak onto a luxury train line like the Orient Express that would no doubt have a decent level of security itself. They're relying on an absurd amount of luck with variables they simply can't account for. Regardless, the plan from there is to incapacitate the real White Widow and Zola, taking their place and learning from the anonymous buyer what the key unlocks, after which Ethan will then parachute off the train with the completed key and leave Grace behind. Naturally, she is concerned by this fact, but Ethan assures her that, after being taken into custody, Kittredge will give her the choice they keep banging on about, and she will join the Suicide Squad. It takes some convincing, but eventually she agrees to help. For the mission, Luther packs Ethan a few things to help out.
I packed you a base parachute and a speed wing, depending on how you need to leave the train.
Now, it's totally reasonable that Luther would be considering multiple options, but judging by the way speed wings function, it seems completely illogical that he would come to the conclusion that a speed wing would be a viable method of departure. Whilst the train is moving, the only way to get off is the parachute. A speed wing simply wouldn't be as effective. It would only be useful if, say, the train stopped over a chasm, which, remarkably, is exactly what happens. Luther must be tapping into the entity or something, because that is one crazy prediction on his behalf. Being the absolute chat he is, he also makes an important change to their means of communication.
And I modified our comms to use skywave radio. Not as reliable as satellite, but completely analog, immune to the entity.
This in itself makes sense given the events of the night before where their comms were hacked by the entity, which ultimately stopped Ethan from being able to save Ilsa. But given how intelligent we know these characters to be, this is a change that should have been implemented from the beginning. Ethan informs Luther and Benji of the power the entity holds at the airport in the early stages of the film, and they directly bear witness to this during the mission as the entity messes with their tech. So after that mission, they should have immediately found alternatives for their means of communication and other digital technologies. Instead, though, they continue to use the equipment until it does in fact get hacked, and it's only at that point they destroy it. The fact that Luther leaves it until this point to change their communications is completely inconsistent with how intelligent he's been shown to be in the past. If he were acting in character, he would have immediately entity-proofed the team's communications, perhaps between the events of the airport and the moment they pick up Ethan after the car chase. Because after they pick him up, Luther himself draws attention to the fact that the entity was erasing Gabriel in real time at the airport, so he was fully aware of its capability and yet still changed nothing. If he'd made the change at that point, then perhaps Ilsa would still be alive. Nevertheless, Luther then informs Ethan that he's going to go completely offline and warns him not to kill Gabriel, as he believes the entity is banking on two possible outcomes for its own survival. Either Ethan dies or Gabriel dies, and with him the intel he has on the entity. In both circumstances, the entity survives, but if Ethan and Gabriel both survive, then the entity is in danger. So the final act and the stakes are built completely on Ethan's rage for Gabriel and how he will act when he gets his hands on him. Up to this point, the information on Gabriel and who he is as a character has been scarce, and his relationship with Ethan has only really been showcased in a brief flashback that's been shown multiple times throughout the film. A flashback we still have no real context for. So this rage that's been built over many years as a result of an event in the past that we have little to no information on regarding characters like Marie, who we still don't know anything about, is meant to fuel this third act. Now, I'm not denying that some of Ethan's rage would stem from the fact that Gabriel recently killed Ilsa, but that's even hard to buy into, as her death doesn't really seem to bother him or any of the other members of the IMF. We're only shown this one scene of Ethan after she dies, and if anything, he doesn't even seem mad, just a little disappointed. And then in the next scene, it honestly seems like Grace, who barely knew her, is the most upset by her death. And I know some people have theorized that she might still be alive, and that's why we're barely showing the team mourning or grieving for her. But if you listen to Rebecca Ferguson talk about Mission Impossible 8, it really sounds like she's not involved.
There was a whole lot of fan upset over your death in Mission Impossible. I am one of those fans that are upset. How did this even come about? Like, what happened here?
To speak very clearly, because I know a lot of people are sad about it. I'm sad about it. I had filmed 3 films. My deal was done. And unless you're going to have a lot of screen time, that's a lot of time sitting around waiting to film a huge movie that could take over a year to film. It is so intoxicatingly exciting when you're rolling, but there's a lot of waiting. Yeah. And the more characters that are brought in, the more waiting. So when you come with another offer, you have to sit down and weigh, I have other offers on the table.
That's fair. I get it. I can't be.
But it was amazing. And the thing is, the outcome is what it is. It's what McQuarrie decides to write. And that was the exit that he thought was best for the character.
Sadly, I do think that's the last we'll see of her. But anyways, whilst Luther and Ethan are talking, the mask machine shits itself whilst making Ethan's mask. Ethan asks Benji if he can fix it, but they simply don't have enough time.
It's very, very dead.
If I had a week, I couldn't fix it. The widow's train leaves in an hour.
So they have to come up with a new plan, and quickly. Ethan decides that Grace will go alone, and Ethan will wait at a point where the train is going slow enough for him to jump on unharmed. She will then approach the buyer, verify the other half of the key, and get the buyer to reveal what the key unlocks.
How?
Figure it out.
What, is he crazy? Huh?
That is a huge assumption that the buyer even knows what the key unlocks. For all they know, the buyer could be operating in a similar manner. Get the key and figure out what it unlocks later. It's worth having the key even if you don't know how to use it, purely due to the power it grants you over the rest of the world by simply having it in your possession. But the team ignore this fact and formulate their plan based completely on the belief that the buyer possesses information that they in fact do not have. Baffled by the fragility of Ethan's plan, Grace is hesitant to go through with it, but has one condition.
Promise me you'll be on that train.
I will be there. No matter what.
And so now we've finally made it to the third act. We see the White Widow and Zola patiently awaiting their meeting with the buyer, and the 2 CIA operatives presumably waiting for Ethan. Meanwhile, Mantis finds her way onto the train and awakens Gabriel from his entity coffin.
He's a dark messiah, the entity's chosen messenger.
From here, he kills the train conductors, speeds up the train, and dismantles the brakes. Oh, and he does this.
He sees death as a gift he wants to share with the rest of the world.
At the same time, Ethan makes his way to the point at which he'll jump onto the train, but due to Gabriel's interference, he completely misses it.
You what?
As a result, he needs another method of getting onto the train, and so Benji searches for an alternative. Whilst this is happening, we see that Grace has made her way onto the train and into the White Widow's cabin. They don't actually show us how she pulled this off, probably because McQuarrie knew how difficult of a task that would have been, how hard it would have been to write, and probably just wanted to get to the train wreck part of the sequence as soon as possible.
I want to wreck a train.
Nonetheless, from here she drugs the White Widow, takes the second half of the key, and makes her way to the buyer with Zola. Zola, who doesn't notice that his sister's most prominent distinguishable feature, her eye colour, is completely different, and that she's also pulled off a record-breaking outfit change. Dead Reckoning here is clearly building on Zola's character from Fallout by establishing him as a complete buffoon. What should happen here is Zola immediately recognizing that this isn't his sister, calling his security, inspecting her room, finding his real sister, and then at minimum putting Grace in some sort of bind, or at maximum executing her on the spot.
Kill her.
If the audience can tell that her eyes are different, then her brother in-universe should absolutely be able to tell. But he's an idiot, so they proceed to the buyer, who turns out to be CIA Director Eugene Kittredge. Zola tells him that they unfortunately don't have the completed key, but Grace dismisses him and reveals that she does indeed have both halves.
While we did agree to provide you with a complete key, I've had a slight problem.
No we haven't. It's just my terms have changed.
Now let's pump the brakes here. The fact that this doesn't immediately signal to Zola that something is amiss is appalling on the writer's behalf. Earlier in the scene when Alana enters her cabin, we see that she is absolutely bricking it because she doesn't have the completed key, and yet is still going ahead with the transaction. And right at the beginning of this sequence, Zola attempts to reassure Alana that they will find Grace and get the other half of the key off her. Because of these two moments, we can almost guarantee that multiple conversations have happened between the two regarding the fact that they only have one half of the key. Perhaps conversations where Alana has outwardly been overtly stressed and even panicked by the fact that they can't give the completed key to the buyer. So the fact that in this moment she pulls the other half of the key seemingly out of thin air should ring alarm bells for Zola.
Alana.
But I guess he's just too thick to connect the dots, so the transaction continues and they wait for the blockchain to be decrypted?
What the fuck does that mean?
Meanwhile, Ethan makes his way to the top of a mountain and Benji instructs him to simply jump off and parachute onto the train. In response to this, Ethan kicks up a massive fuss about the impracticality of such a stunt, drawing attention to the sheer stupidity of what Benji is asking him to do.
Benji, it doesn't work like that. I'm not that high. There's ledges sticking out everywhere. I'm gonna hit them before the parachute even opens.
I don't believe it for a second.
Even if I could get the parachute open, I don't know if I can make it across the valley and intercept and land safely on a moving train.
Whilst what Ethan is saying may make sense to an audience member if they were to find themselves in a similar situation, let me just remind you that this is Ethan Hunt we're talking about, and he is speaking completely out of character. That's not to say that he wouldn't psych himself up, as we've seen plenty of instances in the past where he's needed to gas himself up for a stunt, like this scene in Fallout for example.
What are you waiting for? I'm jumping out a window!
But I wouldn't say he's psyching himself up in this moment. That's something he actually does later. Here, he's just wasting time and being difficult for the sake of it. He told Grace that he would be there no matter what, and yet when tasked with something a teensy bit difficult, he carries on like a child. The fact of the matter is that he would never kick up a fuss like this. He would simply figure it out, just like he always does.
I'm gonna get the detonator.
What? How?
I'll figure it out.
How are you gonna get it?
I'll figure it out.
How?
How?
Figure it out.
In this instance, though, it feels like he's not actually talking to Benji, but rather the audience. He's clearly just trying to amplify the danger of the stunt that's about to take place, as it isn't necessarily communicated in the stunt itself. But more on that later. This comes across as insecure on the writing front, with this back and forth between the two characters purely existing to assure the audience that the stunt is in fact dangerous, even if it doesn't seem that way. Tom Cruise is basically saying to the audience, what I'm about to do is just so dangerous, please guys believe me, I committed myself to Scientology for this. Nevertheless, he spots this rock on the side of the cliff that looks conveniently like a ramp, and as he prepares himself for the jump, we are treated to flashbacks of a few of the important women in Ethan's life. The first being the mystery woman from Ethan's past established in earlier flashbacks, who we still know absolutely nothing about. The second being Ilsa, who unceremoniously died in a way that almost feels disrespectful to her as a character, and the third being Grace. The idea here is that Ethan will not let another woman he cares about die needlessly, an idea we as an audience should be well aware of by now. But what is odd about this is how the film completely forgets about Lindsay from MI3, another woman Ethan couldn't save, or hell, even a reference to the suffering he put his wife Julia through would make this more meaningful. On another note, why is it specifically women that he visualizes? McQuarrie has since explained that these women are the ones he cares about most.
That created the shape suddenly of Marie as something that became very necessary in terms of establishing Ethan's distant past. And Ilsa defined his present, and then Grace determines the future.
And yet, McQuarrie has been very clear that Ilsa and Ethan's relationship was never romantic.
Every time we looked at Ilsa as a love interest, it diminished her as a character. She is as much a member of the team as Luther or Benji, and is not defined by her gender. Her affinity for Ethan, her closeness to him that is forged in something that is not sexual or physical. In some other world, they would be compatible, but they have duties and responsibilities that will forever keep them apart.
So if these aren't his love interests, why don't we see others who Ethan wasn't able to save in his past? Someone like Alan Hunley from the previous film perhaps, or the IMF secretary in Ghost Protocol. As it stands though, we have one person who we know nothing about, another who the audience has grown to love over the past couple films, and then Grace, a character who is severely underdeveloped, highly contradictory, and a rehash of a character that already existed in this franchise. That's without even mentioning how much she screwed Ethan over in this film. From taking the key and dipping at the airport, to handcuffing him to the steering wheel and basically leaving him for dead at the conclusion of the car chase in Rome, with no real reason to believe he would have the skill set to pick the lock. Seriously, how would she know? But throughout all this, Ethan's been nothing but compassionate towards her. She kinda sucks, and yet she is supposed to carry the emotional weight of this scene. That's not to say that Ethan shouldn't or wouldn't want to save her, as we know by now that he'll always do what he can to save the members of his team. What's distasteful is placing her on the same level as Ilsa, who has also worked against Ethan in the past, but has always had reasonable motivation for doing so. Grace, however, operates purely for her own gain. Regardless, this gives Ethan the push he definitely wouldn't need, and so he kickstarts his bike and rockets down the ramp, and thus concludes the setup for the stunt. So what exactly are the issues here? Well, for starters, the stunt can only occur if Ethan misses the train at the designated jumping on point, which he does as a result of Gabriel speeding up the train. However, the problem precedes all of this. Why did Ethan and Benji leave it so late, arriving at the designated jumping on point at the last possible second? Why wasn't he in position with time to spare as the train approached, ready to jump on, much like Mantis was? Keep in mind that before Gabriel speeds up the train, Benji tells Ethan that they are a few minutes ahead of schedule.
The train is on schedule and you're a few minutes early, so we have plenty of time.
But then proceeds to say that it should be approaching the curve in 2 minutes.
It should be slowing down for the curve in exactly 2 minutes.
Ethan still hasn't made it to that point, so whatever time he's supposedly ahead of schedule has to be less than 2 minutes, which is so minimal and risky in itself. What I think we're led to believe is that Ethan and Benji were running on such fine margins that they could only get to the jumping on point within 2 minutes of when the train would actually pass the curve. But I just don't believe they would let this happen. Now, if we take it back to the scene where the mask machine breaks and the team are forced to formulate a new plan, Benji points out that the train leaves in an hour. So as soon as they changed the plan, Ethan and Benji should have left immediately to ensure nothing was left to chance. It was absolutely crucial for Ethan to get on the train and get on at the designated jumping on point. So Ethan would no doubt take his motorbike and drive as fast as he could to get to that point. He's even stressed when Benji assures him he's ahead of schedule.
Just keep me on time and on track, whatever it takes. Yeah, will do.
But let's take a closer look at this timeline. From what we can tell, the Zola mask is pretty close to being finished. So let's say it would have taken an extra 10 minutes to complete. This means the team was allowing roughly 50 minutes to get Ethan and Grace onto the train because
the Widow's train leaves in an hour.
So let's assume that's exactly how long it was going to take to get them there. Seeing as Ethan will no longer be getting on the train and they can leave immediately, they now have the full hour to get Grace onto the train alone. On top of this, as Ethan cannot get close to the train out of fear of being spotted by Zola's informants, he should leave immediately and utilize the full hour to get ahead of the train and arrive at the designated boarding point with time to spare. But let's say he did go to the train to drop Grace off. Taking the 50 minutes they accounted for, they would get there with 10 minutes to spare, and then Ethan could leave immediately from that point, getting a comfortable head start. Not that this would happen, but even if it did, there's no reason he would be late or even on time. He would be comfortably ahead of the train in each of these scenarios. Being comfortably ahead of schedule is an assurance I believe Ethan would make. Not only because he promised Grace that he would be there, but because he just lost Ilsa as a result of being too late to save her. There's no way he would make that mistake again. And because of this, it brings into question his strange behavior when he reaches the summit. He's concerned about Grace, and yet is incredibly reluctant to do what Benji is asking of him. Would Ethan really behave in this manner? Especially when the stunt isn't even that big a deal, at least in comparison to his previous exploits. Now, Benji obviously reminds him he has a parachute, but Ethan's main concern is the cliffside.
There's ledges sticking out everywhere. I'm gonna hit them before the parachute even opens.
In that case, Ethan, why not use the speed wing that Luther luckily packed along with your parachute? The problem seems to be that you need to build up some horizontal velocity before making the jump in order to avoid the ledges on the cliffside. So wouldn't a speed wing, a piece of equipment that requires minimal horizontal velocity to get you in the air, be perfect in this situation? If you look at all the behind the scenes footage, it almost seems too good to be true. Not to mention the fact that the additional speed a speed wing provides will not only get him there quicker, but might actually allow him to land safely on top of the train whilst it's moving at breakneck speed. But the writers purposely forgot about it here, as it was only intended for his getaway later in the film. There was no intention for Ethan to use it when it actually makes sense within the plot. Its existence prioritizes the payoff before natural plot progression and character decisions. They wanted their big train crash, and the parachute simply wouldn't be anywhere near as effective for the getaway at the end of that sequence. So Luther luckily provides him with a speed wing because it's perfect for the final getaway, but they forget that it would also be perfect here. It wouldn't be quite as epic as riding a motorcycle off a cliff though, would it?
Well, you've got me there.
On top of all this, are we really supposed to believe that this was the best option to get on the train? If we take a look at the geography of the situation, Ethan has somehow managed to get miles ahead of the train, and apparently the only way, or perhaps the best way to get on, is riding and parachuting off this cliff.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
We've already seen that Mantis found another way on, and you're telling me Ethan could get this far ahead but couldn't find something similar? It wouldn't be as impressive, but it'd make much more sense. And yes, I'm aware that the train is moving faster than usual, so it would no doubt hurt if he tried to jump on. But let's not forget the way he actually makes his way on. Another problem with this setup is that the stakes are underdeveloped, unclear, and hard to buy into. It is not evident to the audience what the consequences are in terms of both the broader plot and what might happen to Grace if Ethan is unable to get onto the train. The whole point of the mission is to obtain the key and find out what it unlocks. But we don't really know what might happen if Ethan and Grace are unsuccessful. We're supposed to believe that the key, no matter what, will fall at Gabriel's feet, a prediction made by the entity that Gabriel revealed the night before.
The completed key will lay itself at my feet. Tomorrow, on the Orient Express.
But what if it falls into Kittredge's hands? Would he even know how to harness it, how to open it? In both scenarios, we have no idea what happens from that point onwards. If the entity gets full control of itself through Gabriel, what would its motive then be? As far as the characters and us as the audience are aware, the entity's motive could be full world domination and control, or it could simply just want to exist. We know it takes extreme measures to achieve its goals, but if by doing so it guarantees its freedom from those who want to harness it or destroy it, who could blame it? There are too many unknown variables for the stakes to be clear should the IMF fail. We don't really know the consequences or how bad the aftermath could be, and therefore it's hard to figure out what exactly the team are trying to prevent. Then there's the threat to Grace, a character we're supposed to care for in a similar light to the way Ethan does, but whose characterization doesn't warrant both their connection or a connection with the audience. We know that Ethan will do whatever it takes to save the one innocent life, yet the film implies their connection exists beyond this moral principle that Ethan holds, like there is something more to their relationship, despite how much of a burden she has been. Throughout the film, she's been nothing but a thorn in Ethan's side, often betraying him and making situations more precarious than they need to be. So why would the writers build stakes centered around her well-being when she hasn't showcased one redeeming or likable quality that would resonate with the audience?
She screws the team over time and time and time again, and the audience never gets tired of it. She also has this absolutely phenomenal smile.
That's not even considering the fact that all the danger she finds herself in could be easily avoided. They make a huge assumption that the buyer knows what the key unlocks, yet I've already explained why this might not be the case. So why not modify the plan so that the mission is simply get the key and get out? The established conflict with Ethan is that if he and Gabriel both survive, then the entity is at risk. And if the fight between these two continues, then more opportunities will arise to find out exactly what the key opens. So the plan should be to get the key, which Grace does quite easily, and immediately leave. They for some reason are certain that the buyer knows what the key unlocks, yet they pull this assumption completely out of their own arse. And funnily enough, we find out later that the buyer doesn't possess this information at all. Only Denlinger does.
And you're certain that you're the only person on Earth who knows where the Sevastopol is?
The only one.
Because of this, the mission should be solely to acquire the other half of the key. That way, the danger of the mission is significantly reduced. The more time Grace spends on the train, the more risk she puts herself in. So she should be trying to remove herself from the situation as soon as possible to avoid prolonging the danger. Yes, it wouldn't be an exciting third act, but the main point here is that if there's a simpler way to achieve their goals, then that's 100% what these characters would be doing. Yet, they don't. It's also probably worth noting that the plan relies on Alana visiting her room prior to the deal. If she doesn't, then Grace doesn't have an opportunity to immobilize her and take her place without being detected, doesn't get the key, and then doesn't fulfill the mission. It's just another element that once again showcases the fragility of the plan and the sheer amount of baseless assumptions the team has made in its formulation. To top this all off, the stakes are also relying on the audience believing that Ethan could die from this jump. And frankly,
that's some bullshit.
This should really be light work for a man of Ethan's talents and could perhaps be one of the easiest stunts he's been required to do in these films. They did try their best to forcefully inject a sense of danger into the stunt, but it's just not very convincing and was always going to be a tough ask, given that the stunt itself is fairly straightforward. Additionally, in these films there is usually some kind of ticking clock, and Ethan has an understanding of what he has to do and how long he has to do it. This is an ever-present element throughout the franchise that typically magnifies the danger of the situation Ethan finds himself in. So what could possibly operate as the ticking clock in this sequence?
And yes, ultimately, the idea of an upload, the tick gave us a ticking clock. The idea of an upload, the tick gave us a ticking clock.
You serious?
How is the blockchain decrypting the ticking clock when it has absolutely zero bearing on what Ethan is doing at that moment in time? If Grace accepts the money or doesn't when the status bar hits 100%, it really doesn't affect Ethan's goal of getting on the train. It's really only relevant to Grace. Surely McQuarrie didn't actually think this ticking clock would be adding to the overall tension of the scene.
The idea of an upload, the tick gave us a ticking clock.
You can't be serious. You kick in the door to my house, all ants in your pants, sucking my left nut. And you're asking if I'm serious?
On top of this, Ethan has no concept of what is currently happening on the train. For all he knows, Grace could already be dead by the time he makes it up to the top of the mountain, or the transaction may not even be close to taking place. But he operates with the assumption that everything is happening at once. And it is, but that is only information that we as an audience should know. The team formulate their plan in a way that Grace is the only one who knows what is happening on the train, which should cause an abundance of problems for Ethan and Benji, who are left completely in the dark. To be clear, it makes sense that he would want to minimize the danger Grace faces by getting on the train as soon as possible, but they've devised a plan that relies on Ethan getting on the train at the perfect time, whilst having no clear idea when that perfect time would be. For this plan to work, Ethan would have to time his arrival on the train to be exactly after the transaction has taken place, with Grace in possession of both the key and the information from the buyer, but before she's been exposed and captured or killed. Because he has no disguise, he needs to minimize his time on the train to avoid being detected by either one of the CIA, Zola and his goons, or Gabrielle. So his timing needs to be absolutely perfect in order for the mission to be a success. Everything consequential happens in a 5-minute window, yet Ethan has no idea that this is the case, and so he would have no clue when his window of opportunity is. There's no viable way he gets onto the train without completely screwing the mission, aside from this incredibly small window of time, especially when considering how he gets on the train, but we'll tackle that later. If he gets on the train 5 minutes late, he finds Grace's corpse lying on the floor with the key missing. If he's 5 minutes too early, he is immediately detected by Zola, Gabriel, and the CIA, ruining any chance he had of obtaining the key. In both scenarios, the mission fails, so relying on all these uncontrollable variables is completely absurd and inconsistent with how thorough these characters typically are when formulating plans. The stunt is built upon a foundation of contrived storytelling and weak character writing. Its presence within the film is completely unnatural, and it fails to set up meaningful stakes for both the stunt and the upcoming third act set piece. Yet what is surprising is that we know the creators behind this film are capable of delivering action sequences that fit seamlessly within a film's overarching plot, whilst aiding character progression. Mission Impossible Fallout is a clear example of this, so let's take a look at the events leading up to Fallout's final action set piece in Kashmir. But first, we need a quick recap. Mission Impossible Fallout follows Ethan Hunt and the IMF in a race to acquire 3 plutonium cores. Working with August Walker and the CIA, their goal is to safely recover the plutonium cores and stop them from getting into the hands of John Lark, an extremist working with a group known as the Apostles who have come to be in possession of the cores. Now, these apostles are what remains of Solomon Lane's syndicate from the previous film who still remain loyal to him. As such, they want Lane broken out of prison and returned to them in exchange for the plutonium cores. Or at least that's what the IMF seem to think. Before the final act, we learn that August Walker is in fact John Lark, and that he and Solomon Lane were in cahoots this entire time. Lane's plan was to frame Ethan as John Lark, rewarding Walker with the plutonium if he helped, but when this fails, they abandon the plan and escape with 2 of the cores. The IMF aren't exactly sure what Walker's plan is at this stage or where they're headed. To best prepare for oncoming nuclear carnage, they familiarize themselves with the nuclear bomb blueprints they acquired earlier in the film. Through these blueprints, they discover the 2 bombs have quite the failsafe.
Walker and Lane have 2 plutonium cores, meaning 2 bombs. Any attempt to defuse one bomb automatically triggers the other, meaning once armed, the bombs cannot be disarmed.
That is fucked.
But that's not all.
The countdown is started via a remote detonator, which is also a failsafe, meaning once the countdown starts, it can't be stopped.
To which Ilsa then makes the danger of the situation pretty damn clear.
So, technically, this is a suicide mission.
And from there, thanks to Luther implanting a transponder on Lane earlier in the film, they track him to Kashmir. More specifically, they track him to a medical camp set up in response to a smallpox outbreak triggered by the Apostles before the events of the film. As they approach the camp, Benji tries to find a way to deactivate the bombs without triggering one another, whilst Ilsa figures out why Lane picked this specific location as ground zero.
Well, the nuclear river is at the base of the Saishan Glacier. So a nuclear blast there would irradiate the largest natural irrigation system in the world. Fresh water from the border of China to India and Pakistan. They're going to starve 1/3 of the world's population.
But luckily, Benji thinks he's found a solution for the bombs.
The remote detonator requires that firing key. If we remove that key, then it should short out the failsafe and allow us to cut both fuses.
And so the plan is set in motion. Someone needs to remove the firing key in the detonator whilst the others simultaneously defuse the bombs. But of course, in typical Mission Impossible fashion, things are never that simple.
In order to make this work, we can't remove the key or cut the fuses until after the countdown starts.
You gotta be fucking kidding me.
Before they make it to the camp, we see Lane assembling one of the bombs and arming it, giving Walker 15 minutes to reach a safe distance. The IMF then finally arrive and attempt to begin their search, but not before Ethan discovers that Julia, his ex-wife, is running the medical camp upon the request of an anonymous donor. It doesn't take long for Ethan to deduce that the smallpox outbreak and subsequent establishment of the medical camp was an elaborate scheme devised to draw Julia to ground zero.
You cheeky fucker!
But anyways, they're running out of time, so they resume the search for the bombs and successfully locate the first. Ethan, Benji, and Ilsa leave Luther to handle it.
Oh, sure. I got this. Don't worry about old Luther.
And they manage to locate Walker, heading to a chopper, detonator in hand, as he activates the bombs, beginning the countdown. They do their best to cut Walker off, but to no avail.
It's too late!
No. Somebody get the detonator.
What? How?
I'll figure it out. Find Lane! Find the other bomb!
And so without a second thought, Ethan sprints and jumps onto the payload of the trailing copter in pursuit of Walker. He doesn't know how he's going to get to Walker, but he knows he has no alternative. He needs that detonator. And with Ethan now in pursuit of Walker, Benji and Ilsa resume the search for the second bomb, with Lane watching on. For a final action set piece, it's an absolutely fantastic setup and makes Dead Reckoning look amateurish by comparison. It's incredibly clear cut. There is no room for the audience to be confused about what is happening and what needs to happen. As such, it effortlessly draws you into the story and the action by establishing all the variables involved with their task. You've got the bombs, the detonator, and the firing key, and then you've got Walker in the chopper and Lane on the ground. So you, as the viewer, know what lies ahead and are left to wonder how exactly the events will unfold. Yet in Dead Reckoning, it's incredibly difficult to discern what needs to happen in the final act for the team to be successful, and what the consequences will be if they aren't. There's no real plan other than to get the key and wait, so it's difficult to feel any kind of excitement for the third act when we have no real clue what lies ahead. Not only because the plan is paper thin, but because there are so many unpredictable variables that the team don't account for. Grace just somehow has to get on the train, find the White Widow, get the key off her, proceed to the transaction, give the buyer the key, pickpocket the key back off him, leave the carriage, find Ethan, give him the key, and do all this without being detected by any of Zola's informants, Zola himself, Kittredge, Gabriel, Mantis, all of the CIA agents.
Why'd you have to make this so fucking complicated?
Yet in Fallout, Ilsa, for example, has to find the other bomb in time and successfully defuse it at the same time as Luther, whilst being conscious of the fact that Solomon Lane is somewhere in the vicinity. The difference is night and day. There's just too much going on in Dead Reckoning. The complicated sequence of events that needs to happen with all the uncontrollable variables in play is just messy. The beginning and ending is easy to understand, it's just the middle part that is completely up in the air, and not in a good way. In Fallout, both us as the audience and the characters know what needs to happen logically from the start of the mission to the end to be successful, but we're still left with questions about how exactly they are going to do what is required of them, and that's where the level of investment and excitement is built. How will Ethan get the detonator from Walker when they're both in different helicopters? The thrill comes from Ethan navigating the situation, making the best decisions he can to succeed in his mission. That's the Mission Impossible promise. Yet in Dead Reckoning, there is no logical through line from the beginning to the end for either the characters or the audience, due to the sheer number of variables and complete lack of a coherent plan. So how are we supposed to care when we have no idea what the fuck is even happening? Now, you might argue that the mystery is half the fun, which might be okay if the following sequence of events did play out in a logical fashion, but they don't. Because there's no telling what could happen on the train, the writers use this to their advantage and things just happen when and how they need to, regardless of any real rhyme or reason. Characters will appear when required, be completely stupid when it's convenient, or even do shit like this. The third act is chaos, and in that chaos, the only way through is pure dumb luck. There are so many possible ways things could go on the train, none of which Ethan or Grace have really planned for or are even able to account for, but everything still works in their favor through nothing but luck. It goes completely against the Mission Impossible promise that the team will make it through by making intelligent decisions, and that's mainly because of the entity. These problems stem from the fact that the writers essentially made the entity unbeatable.
You've no idea the power I represent. Thousands of quadrillions of computations per millisecond, parsing every possible cause and effect into a very real map of a most probable next.
So how can you write a coherent story where the characters beat an overpowered villain that has the ability to predict exactly what will happen? You don't, clearly. Instead, the characters just have to get lucky, time and time again. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let's reel it back a bit. The mountain of unanswered questions in the setup also lead to the consequences being totally unclear. In Fallout, we know what will happen if the team isn't successful on both a personal and global level. The aftermath couldn't be simpler, yet in Dead Reckoning, the sheer number of variables at play undermines the danger of the situation. If Ethan doesn't make the jump and get onto the train, then at that point in the film, it's hard to discern what the consequences would be. We're supposed to believe Grace would find herself in trouble, yet we have no idea what that may even look like. Gabriel is clearly a complete wildcard, and Zola's incompetency could lead to any number of things. But if Kittredge and the CIA were to get to Grace first, then she'd probably just get arrested and be completely fine. The mission could go any number of ways, and so by not knowing exactly what the consequences could be, it makes it hard to have any level of investment. Not to mention that the bigger overarching stakes of the entire film are not made clear at all. In Fallout, we know exactly what the global consequences are, but in Dead Reckoning, it's a complete mystery. As a result, the main thing the audience has to latch onto is who obtains the key, but even that only prompts further questions that have no clear-cut answers. And because of these unclear consequences, the stunt struggles to establish any suspense or tension to engage the audience. In Fallout, the suspense is built upon the severity and simplicity of the consequences brought on by failure, the understanding of what needs to happen, and the investment in finding out how exactly the team will pull it off. Each character is positioned in such a way that it seems impossible for them to complete the mission, and the excitement is generated from a desire of wanting to know how they're going to do it. For instance, we know Ethan needs to get the detonator from Walker, but how the hell is he going to get into Walker's chopper? We know Benji and Ilsa need to find the other bomb, but will they be able to find it in time and successfully coordinate the defusal with Luther? And what's Lane going to do to stop them? The questions are exciting, and the payoffs are satisfying. Dead Reckoning fails in this regard as the consequences are convoluted, the plane is full of holes, and the characters haven't been interestingly positioned such that the audience is invested in finding out how they will get the job done. The only question this stunt poses is how Ethan will actually get onto the train, but as will be discussed later, the answer isn't satisfying, it's ridiculous. We're supposed to be worried for Grace, much like Ethan, and it's the film's intention for the stakes to be built upon a certain level of investment for the character. A character who's shown no nobility and a sheer lack of morality, yet we're expected to root for her becoming part of the team. Through Ethan's flashback, the writers place her on the same pedestal as Ilsa, despite not having 10% of the character or chemistry with the main cast. We're simply expected to like her because Ethan does, but his fondness of her is entirely unmotivated, which is evident in their very first interaction.
Hi.
In stark contrast to this, Fallout places the team we've grown to love over the course of several films in danger. Characters who have been shown to value each other over themselves, risking their lives time and time again for not only the good of the world, but each other.
Let me help you find it. That's why I brought you here in the first place, and look what happened. I can't protect you. That's why I need you to leave. It's not your decision to make, Ethan. I know the risks. More than that, I am your friend. You called me because you needed my help. And you still do. So I am staying. And that is all we are going to say about that. Okay.
And these characters may sometimes have ulterior motives, but once you understand them, they become all the more sympathetic. And that's without even mentioning Julia, who once again finds herself in danger due to her prior involvement with Ethan, and who acts as a representation of the innocent lives at risk. Our investment in these characters is self-evident, and as a result, the stakes are sky high. It's a shame that McQuarrie and Cruz dropped the ball so hard with the setup for arguably the biggest moment in Dead Reckoning, especially considering how successful Fallout is at setting up its own final act. Perhaps a result of their run-and-gun style of filmmaking, which simply wasn't equipped for handling a storyline centered around an all-knowing AI. An idea like that would require an incredibly tight script to be effective, and a shitload of drafts, but that's something McQuarrie clearly doesn't prioritize.
So the most terrifying thing that I will share with your listeners, there was no first draft.
Yeah, no shit. All this, and we haven't even tackled the stunt itself yet.
Relax, Luther. It's much worse than you think.
Now, you would think that, in theory, riding a motorbike off a cliff and then parachuting onto a moving train would be pretty damn cool to see, especially when we know that Tom Cruise actually did the stunt. But I couldn't help but feel that the execution was seriously underwhelming. So let's discuss the action. After Ethan's got to the summit and pictured Grace and her cheeky grin,
She also has this absolutely phenomenal smile.
he takes a moment to compose himself before accelerating and riding off the cliff edge. As he plummets, we see a few shots of Ethan from quite a distance before we get up close and personal with him, learning what exactly is going through his head.
I'm trying to get away from this mountain!
Which he does with ease and pulls his parachute. And that's the stunt. That is it. All of the build-up in the promotional material for the film for this, don't get me wrong, Tom Cruise pulling something like this off is mighty impressive. But when I was sitting in the theater watching it for the first time, the moment felt so underwhelming, so anticlimactic, especially when compared to some of the stunts Ethan has done in the past. Perhaps the marketing shouldn't have rested so heavily on this moment, as I feel like it basically set it up to fail. For one, what's supposed to be generating the danger in this situation for Ethan to be so reluctant? The film tries to establish that the danger stems from the cliffside,
There's ledges sticking out everywhere. I'm gonna hit them before the parachute even opens.
which then explains his exclamation as he plummets to the ground below.
I'm trying to get away from this mountain!
But all this seems like a poor attempt to amplify the danger of the situation because it simply just doesn't translate to the screen. They're desperately trying to convince the audience how risky the jump is, as it isn't self-evident. That's without even mentioning the fact that he could literally use the speedwing Luther packed for him, or that we are actually shown before he jumps that there are no ledges in sight.
Bitch, where? There's ledges sticking out everywhere.
Bitch, where?
The crux of the problem lies in the fact that the stunt wasn't designed to show you what Ethan Hunt is doing. It's designed to show you how much of a lunatic Tom Cruise is, and for the audience to be impressed by what he did, not what Ethan is doing. Yet this just draws attention to the fact that the writers clearly crammed the stunt into the plot of the film, regardless of it fitting. In addition to being seriously underwhelming, the stunt doesn't develop or showcase anything meaningful about Ethan's character. Through his flashback, the film is trying to make a point here about the women in Ethan's life and the responsibility he feels for their deaths. But by first choosing to show someone the audience has no context for, then Ilsa, who the audience actually does care about, and finally Grace, who Ethan has become attached to for no real reason, it fails to convey anything of substance. The film wants to act like this is what the whole story has been building to, that Ethan needs to overcome this test to prove his worth or his character, that Ethan is battling within himself to make this jump. And if he doesn't do it, Grace may meet the same fate as Marie and Ilsa. But what he does here isn't some significant revelation or surprise. Of course Ethan would put himself on the line, and would do so with no second thought, yet this big crescendo builds for him to then do exactly what we as an audience would expect.
What's the point of that?
Another thing that I think detracts from the danger of the stunt in the film is the poor CGI. Now we know from the behind the scenes footage that they had to build a ramp for Tom Cruise to drive off, so naturally they had to hide the ramp with CGI, which is totally fine. I'm not here to criticize the fact that they used CGI. as it's been ever present throughout the franchise and was necessary in this circumstance because Tom Cruise simply wouldn't have been allowed to ride off the literal cliffside, even though he probably would have been game. The problem is that the environment they crafted to mask the ramp is so unnatural that it completely detracts from the realism of the stunt, and the integration between what is real and what is not isn't executed as well as they may have hoped.
We wanted to build upon the previous films and apply all of that knowledge to something practical and real. No one else in the world is doing this level of practical filmmaking, and it may never be done again.
In these VFX breakdowns, it's clear that, for the most part, everything but Tom Cruise and the body of his bike was digitally replaced. I mean, they even replaced his wheels. Perhaps the most unrealistic aspect of the digital environment is the ramp itself, a conveniently placed jagged rock that would work perfectly as a ramp. Maybe Benji was able to locate it with his tech, but then why didn't he verbally direct Ethan towards it when he reached the summit and started having a sook? I mean, the movie thinks he needs a ramp to avoid the ledges, but as I've established, they're non-existent. So you could literally build up some horizontal velocity and just send it over the flat edge of the cliffside, completely removing the need for this unrealistic bullshit. Or even better, just use the goddamn speed wing. I'm assuming they made this creative choice to add to the gravitas of the situation. The bigger, the better. But the realism of the Mission Impossible stunts is what makes them so exhilarating, and yet the majority of shots in this sequence look so fake that it completely takes you out of the moment. Even though we know Tom Cruise actually did the stunt, the danger of it all just doesn't translate well to the screen, and this is in part due to the way it was filmed. Typically, in a sequence like this, the most effective way to draw the audience in is to bring them along with the character, utilizing lengthy shots that are up close and personal. That way we hear, see, and feel every bit of danger that the character does, experiencing the moment as if we were in their shoes. And both McQuarrie and Cruise are fully aware of the importance of this.
How do we involve the audience? I just want to give them that thrill.
That means the camera has to be in front of Tom and as close to him as possible.
Because if we do it all, we don't capture it right, what's the point?
Yet in this moment, I couldn't help but feel completely disconnected. Rather than being in the action with Ethan or an observer to it, as most of the shots are filmed from afar, in a similar fashion to what you'd basically see in a Red Bull stunt. During the sequence, we cut between a few different shots, rather than holding on any of them. And in every single shot, he gets further and further away from the camera. So rather than experiencing the danger with him, we find ourselves being pulled away. We do eventually get a couple closer shots of Ethan in an attempt to sell the danger. But the problem is that throughout the entire sequence, Ethan never actually looks like he's even close to hitting any ledges. I mean, look at this shot. He is absolutely miles away from the side of the mountain. That's without even mentioning the fact that the ledges don't exist. With this one shot, the film completely contradicts itself, drawing attention to the non-existent ledges, which subsequently negates any of the danger it has been trying to establish and force down the audience's throat. This may be one of the most effortless stunts Ethan has ever had to do. The danger exists, but it's minimal, and the jump goes according to plan with no complications, which is all well and great for Ethan, but for us as an audience, it's just not very interesting to watch. There's no excuse for such mediocre execution either, as we know that McQuarrie is perfectly capable of constructing exhilarating stunts that also serve a purpose beyond the action, and the Halo jump in Fallout is a perfect example of this. To better showcase the superiority of the Halo jump though, we need a little context. After losing the plutonium at the beginning of the film, Ethan and IMF Secretary Alan Hunley discuss the mission ahead of them. John Lark is meeting the White Widow at the Grand Palais in Paris to negotiate delivery of what the IMF presume is the plutonium, and Ethan's mission is to intercept him. Now, just to remind you, earlier in the film, Ethan was faced with a tough decision.
We'll make you a deal, Hunt. Give us the plutonium, and we won't kill your friend.
Don't you do it, Ethan! Not for me!
And he of course chose to save Luther, which has led to the sequence of events that follow. And Hunley draws attention to this perceived flaw in Ethan's character.
You had a terrible choice to make in Berlin. Recover the plutonium or save your team. You chose your team and now the world is at risk. Some flaw deep in your core being simply won't allow you to choose between one life and millions. You see that as a sign of weakness. To me, that's your greatest strength.
Now this plays right into the thematic point of the film, so hold on to that, as it will become relevant. Their conversation is then interrupted as CIA Director Erica Sloan and Agent August Walker shut down the plane. She proceeds to be heavily critical of both Ethan and the IMF's methods, and we have a bit of a back and forth between Hunley and Sloan.
And if he had held on to the plutonium in Berlin, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
And his team would be dead.
Yes, they would. That's the job.
She then insists that Walker will join Ethan on his mission to ensure its success.
You use a scalpel. I prefer a hammer.
The contrast between the values and practices of the IMF and the CIA is effortlessly showcased through this conversation. The IMF prefer deception and espionage, whereas the CIA have no problem using brute force to get what they want. This is then further brought to life shortly after when Ethan relays the plan to Walker.
You're why we don't have a living witness who can identify John Mark or the Apostles.
If you have a problem with my methods, you can always stay behind.
Once again, the contrast between these two characters and their own personal ideals and values is ever apparent, setting up an interesting dynamic that draws you into the relationship these two will have throughout the course of the film, whilst also cleverly hinting at Walker's true nature. But enough about that, let's get to the stunt. Whilst Ethan and Walker suit up, Ethan makes sure Walker has his oxygen on to avoid blacking out and gives him a quick rundown of the situation. He then goes to inspect the conditions and finds that a storm awaits them. Naturally, he wants to rethink the plan as it's become too risky, but Walker is having none of it. He detaches Ethan's oxygen and jumps anyway. As a result, Ethan has no choice but to quickly reattach his oxygen and jump after him, head on into the storm. Once again, another instance of him jumping straight into a dangerous situation when the moment calls for it. And in the end, his concern for the storm was completely warranted.
What's the matter, Hunt? Afraid of a little lightning?
As Ethan comes out of the storm disoriented, we see the city below and hear the altitude readings begin to drop.
20,000 feet. Bitch.
He tries to locate Walker and finds that he is falling unconscious. As he won't just let him die, Ethan makes his way over to Walker and eventually manages to catch him, but sends them both spinning uncontrollably through the air as a result. When he manages to get a handle on the situation, Ethan finds that Walker's oxygen is broken. As the ground rushes ever closer beneath them, Ethan has to act quickly. He attaches his canister to Walker and tries to wake him up, but there's no time. As they're told to deploy, Ethan pulls Walker's chute before his own, and as a result, narrowly escapes with his life.
Intense.
Now, it's worth noting that if we strip this stunt all the way back, it's very similar to the bike jump in Dead Reckoning. In both, Ethan is trying to get from point A to point B, from the mountain to the train, and from the plane to the palais, and there is naturally a jumping element to both of them. But the halo jump in Fallout is vastly superior in its execution. Now, both stunts do have an additional layer of danger for the character beyond the stunt. In Dead Reckoning, it's the ledges,
Bitch, where?
and in Fallout, it's the storm. The difference between the two is that the storm actually plays a crucial role in the set piece. In Fallout, the storm is the driving force of the action, causing a complication between point A and point B that heightens the drama of the scene and makes it more than just a jump with a destination. Instead, Ethan is faced with the incredibly difficult task of saving an immobilized Walker before they smash into the ground, which provides the perfect foundation for a nail-biting sequence of events. The ledges in Dead Reckoning, however, are only really conveyed through dialogue. There's no moment where he's shown in danger of hitting them. In fact, we're shown the opposite, that the ledges don't exist. In Fallout though, the danger is present. From a writing standpoint, we have all these different elements of danger working together to draw you in. The storm, the ground below, and Ethan's task to save Walker. And this is only aided by how effectively the danger is translated visually, making it impossible to look away. We find ourselves in tight amongst the action for the majority of the scene in an expertly executed one-shot sequence. Following Ethan the whole time, we feel, see, and hear everything that he does as the events play out in front of him. The camera movements are disorienting at times as our characters spin uncontrollably through the air, and if the city drawing closer and closer in the background wasn't enough, the audible altitude readings function as a ticking clock, informing Ethan and the audience how fast certain death is approaching.
Walker! Walker!
Altitude, 10,000 feet.
The tension is unrelenting, the danger is evident, and the visual effects are seamless. They're as grand in scale as the visual effects in Dead Reckoning, with most of the background and surroundings being digitally replaced. But rather than being distracting and taking you out of the scene, they look sublime. Aside from a thoroughly gripping action sequence, the halo jump also expertly explores the themes of the film and the characters through the action, something that is poorly executed in the bike stunt. Not only do we witness the conflict and contrast between Ethan and Walker before the jump, epitomizing this notion of the hammer and the scalpel and establishing these two characters as polar opposites, but we also gain a better understanding of Ethan's principles through the choices he makes. During the jump, Ethan chooses to risk both himself and the mission for Walker's sake. He makes this choice even though Walker has been nothing but antagonistic towards him, and by jumping straight into the storm is the reason they get into this mess in the first place. Knowing the importance of the mission and the risks he would have to take to save Walker in this situation, it would make so much more sense for Ethan to let him fall. Walker would die, yes, but the mission could still go ahead, and he would save countless lives whilst only losing Walker's. On the other hand, if Ethan tries to save Walker and is unsuccessful, then they both die, and from Ethan's point of view, there will be nothing standing between Lark and his plutonium. So the choice here for Ethan should be pretty obvious. However, in line with Ethan's values and the thematic point of the film, Ethan chooses the significantly riskier option to save Walker, because to him, the one life is just as important as the many. The events of this film occur as a result of this core principle that Ethan possesses, having to face the fallout of all his good intentions to the point where Lane's entire plan actually hinges on it. And this is just one of the many instances in the film that reinforces his core character traits. What's most interesting about this particular sequence is that Ethan's principles actually result in him saving John Lark before his plan with the plutonium even begins.
You're making a mistake.
No. The mistake was mine when I saved your life over Paris.
With many moments like this throughout the film, Ethan's philosophy is put to the test and brought into question by those around him. This innate desire he has to save absolutely everyone, no matter the cost, just doesn't seem sustainable. Yet throughout all his trials and tribulations, even when his decisions tend to cause more harm than good, Ethan still believes it to be worth it. And in the end, he's proven to be right. So where was all this in Dead Reckoning? Rather than servicing the characters or themes within the film, Dead Reckoning's stunt just exists for the sake of it. A bucket list item for Tom Cruise, perhaps.
There would be a motorcycle jump off a cliff into a base jump. I wanted to do it since I was a little kid.
That's bullshit. Yeah, it's bullshit.
It's baffling to think that these two action scenes were created by the same team, when, like Ethan and Walker, they are polar opposites in their implementation and craft. One is a jump that explores the inner workings of our characters and the consequences of their decisions whilst being a nail-biting, tension-filled plummet to the death. The other is just a jump with some scary cliffs.
You're a piece of shit. And you're ugly. And you ooze sleaze. And you're very, very ugly.
But we're not done just yet. We've had a look at the setup and the stunt itself. Now it's time to take a look at how the film bridges this stunt with the main plot on the Orient Express. So let's take a look at the aftermath. After Ethan deploys his parachute, we rejoin Grace, who is about to complete the transaction with Kittredge. At the same time, the real White Widow awakens and starts making her way to the carriage where the deal is taking place, which is awfully convenient timing. Surely whatever Grace injected her with would have been more effective than that, maybe lasting upwards of an hour at least. Instead, she's shown to be waking up only moments after Grace has taken her place. Were the IMF on a budget or something and couldn't afford anything stronger?
Yes.
Having changed her mind, Grace declines the transaction, gives Kittredge the key, and then unknowingly pickpockets it back off him. Zola is completely dumbfounded by what he thinks is Alana giving up the key free of charge, and rightfully so, but does absolutely nothing about it.
Keep him safe until we get to the station.
Alana.
As Grace hastily makes an exit, the real White Widow pulls up.
Alana?
Who the hell else would it be?
She asks about the key, and Kittredge has the brain capacity to realize that the other widow must have stolen it off him. But you know who doesn't have the brain capacity?
She's got the key.
The other one!
Meanwhile, Grace makes her escape, takes off her mask, and attempts to stop the train. But thanks to Gabriel cutting the brakes earlier, she is unsuccessful. Big Brain Zola then comes barreling down the train in hot pursuit, firing his gun in the air to halt Grace in her tracks. At this point, we see Ethan is currently parachuting towards the train.
I see the train! I don't think I'm gonna make it!
With Grace in his sights, Zola demands the key, threatening to shoot her if she doesn't oblige. So she places it down and Zola's mate grabs it, and then Zola tells him to kill her.
Fuck is this?
So he wants the key and threatens to kill her. And once she hands it over, then you decide to kill her anyway?
You went full retard, man. Never go full retard.
Why not just kill her immediately and take the key? Why wait? Could it be because the writers need to build the tension right before Ethan...
You can't keep getting away with it!
This is one of the most immersion-breaking moments in the film, utterly destroying any suspension of disbelief. Somehow, Ethan jumps off the cliff, approaches the train via parachute, and smashes through the right window in the right carriage at the perfect time to save Grace's life. The odds of this happening are absurdly small, yet the writers seem to think that this moment is funny enough to excuse just how insanely lucky Ethan gets.
It's so dumb.
It's so dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb!
After this moment, Zola is dazed on the floor, unable to get up and finish the both of them off, even though he wasn't anywhere near the blast radius, so he should be completely unaffected, perhaps slightly confused by what's just unfolded in front of him. Nevertheless, when Zola does get up, he grabs the key and is about to shoot Ethan, but considering we've already made the jump into Fantasyland at this point, the writers decided to double down on the bullshit, and so Ethan's parachute opens exactly when he needs it to.
Oh, this just gets worse and worse.
As a result of this, Gabriel rolls up, and the key is his for the taking. There is so much I need to unpack in these few moments, so bear with me. For one, everything important is conveniently happening at the same time. The jump, the deal, and then the danger Grace finds herself in. For a train journey that takes roughly 4.5 hours, the odds of all these events playing out simultaneously are extremely unlikely, and frankly ridiculous. Especially when Ethan doesn't know what is happening on the train at any given time. But the writers need it to happen this way to generate the tension and suspense in the scene. Tension and suspense that is reliant upon characters not behaving in the ways they should. To get to this moment, Zola is reduced to an incompetent baboon. He's unable to register that his sister is acting completely out of character, that she for some unexplained reason now has both halves of the key, and that her eye color and outfit have completely changed. But I believe he would be fully capable of connecting the dots here, regardless of how stupid he's shown to be in this whole ordeal. Yes, he may be the brute whilst Alana is the brains of their operation, but there's no world where he doesn't identify that this widow is an imposter and immediately apprehend her. The writers make him so dumb that even when he's directly told there's 2 Alanas, he's still got no fucking clue what's going on.
She's got the key.
You're a donut! You're so stupid! You're so stupid! You're stupid!
And then there's Ethan in this moment, who's up in the air parachuting in, trying to figure out how exactly he's going to get onto the train. He also seems to think that he isn't going to make it.
I see the train! I don't think I'm gonna make it!
But this line is just another poor attempt to further dramatize the scene and make it seem like Grace has no hope of rescue, which, to be honest, she shouldn't. But at this point in time, Ethan has no idea what's happening on the train. He has no way to identify what kind of situation Grace may be in, whether she's safe or in danger, or whether the deal has already taken place or not. And so with absolutely zero information to get on the train, Ethan decides the best course of action is to smash in through a window. How could he possibly conclude that this was the best way to get on the train? What if the passengers who were sitting there only moments before hadn't been forced to leave the carriage by Zola, and Ethan just came smashing through with no regard for their safety? This choice is completely out of character for Ethan and goes completely against the principles he has been shown to hold in prior films helmed by McQuarrie. Ethan always prioritizes the lives of the innocent, so directly doing something that would put them in harm's way by his own hand is completely inconsistent with his character. In this scenario, wouldn't it just make the most sense for Ethan to land safely on top of the train and make his way in from there? That's definitely what I thought was going to happen when Benji told him to use the parachute. And in that moment, Ethan himself even says that he's not sure if he can land safely on a moving train.
But even if I could get the parachute open, I don't know if I can make it across the valley and intercept and land safely on a moving train.
So landing on top was clearly the way he visualized it himself, but I guess plans change. Now, we obviously know that he needed to save Grace, and with the way everything is so unnaturally constructed in this sequence, this was probably his only option. But as I've mentioned, Ethan has absolutely no clue what is happening on the train at any time during his descent. He's only in contact with Benji, and the film doesn't establish any form of communication or intel that would give them any indication of Grace's situation at any one time. He quite simply doesn't have the knowledge to be saving Grace's life intentionally in this moment. So why in the fuck did he make this choice? The only viable way he might be able to find out that Grace is in trouble is if he somehow gets a visual on her situation through the windows, which he just wouldn't be able to do. And he wouldn't have any reason to look through the windows as his sole focus is getting on the train. He even verbalizes his concerns for this.
I don't think I'm gonna make it!
He doesn't say anything about Grace because that's not on his mind right now, and he doesn't know anything about her situation. All he cares about is getting on that train. And I believe that Ethan Hunt we know would choose the most viable method and land on top. But apparently not. We see earlier in the scene that the train has 10 carriages and 10 windows per carriage, so he has a 1 in 100 chance of smashing through the right window to save Grace, who he, let's not forget, has no idea is in need of saving at this point in time, and he picks the exact right one. That's without even mentioning the fact that he couldn't have timed it more perfectly, arriving at the exact moment the tension peaks. The jump off the cliff to his brute force entrance aligns perfectly with Grace being exposed and staring down the barrel of a gun. Each of these individual events could have happened at any time during the train's journey, but somehow they all happened within the same time frame of one another.
That's some bullshit.
Once again, let me reiterate that if he's even 2 minutes too early, he smashes through the window when the transaction is finishing up a couple carriages down and kills a handful of innocent passengers. And if he's 2 minutes too late, he smashes in and finds Grace with a bullet in her skull.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, well.
So he couldn't have possibly got any luckier. Another thing worth considering is the sheer force of the impact Ethan would experience in this moment. He generates that much force that he is able to completely smash through the first window and send Zola's goon flying out the other one on the opposite side. It's one thing that the goon was conveniently standing directly in the path of both windows to allow Ethan to hit him as he came through, but to be traveling fast enough to send him through the other one yet remain unharmed himself? I know he's been quite durable over the years, but that's a bit of a stretch. He has no cuts, no broken bones, no visible damage, nothing besides being a bit dazed, but even then, he's lucid enough to beat Gabriel in hand-to-hand combat shortly after. It's hard enough to believe that he makes it out of this alive, let alone injury-free. We obviously can't say the same about Zola's goon though, as he's definitely dead, but he was considerate enough to drop the key before being yeeted out the window, which ultimately leads to the key falling at Gabriel's feet as the entity predicted. The thing is though, I just simply don't believe the entity could possibly predict this fuckery. This moment doesn't rely on cause and effect. It relies on outrageous luck and absurdity. The writers needed the entity to possess this level of computational power in order to get themselves out of tough spots, but the entity just simply shouldn't have the power to predict something as farcical as this. But it did, and so Gabriel takes off with the key, heading to the roof of the train where Ethan finds him and a little fight between the two takes place. As far as the midpoint between action scenes go,
It sucks fucking shit.
The odds are absurd, the likelihood of survival is minimal, and the sheer number of contrivances is overwhelming. So with that in mind, let's take a look at another example in Fallout that actually delivers. Specifically, I want to focus on the midpoint between the Solomon Lane breakout and the Ilsa chase sequence. But first, let me set the scene. To obtain the plutonium from the White Widow, Ethan is tasked with intercepting and breaking out Solomon Lane. Zola, the genius, outlines his plan to Ethan, and we see that it involves lots of unnecessary casualties. Obviously, Ethan isn't a big fan of Zola's plan, and so he devises one of his own, which we as an audience are not made aware of until it plays out in front of us. A risky plan at that, but one that pays off in the end as the team manage to capture Lane and escape themselves, preventing the deaths of many innocent lives in the process, and once again reinforcing the thematic throughline of the film. Now, in these films, when the mission is a success, we typically cut away to whatever may be next in the story. But in Fallout, we continue following the team, and the reason becomes clear almost immediately. As they ascend from the catacombs of Paris with Lane in hand, meet up with Walker, and try to make an inconspicuous escape in a new vehicle, they find themselves in quite the predicament. They pull back the doors to reveal a police officer right in front of them. She takes one look at Lane and Luther and immediately clocks that something is amiss. As such, Ethan steps forward to defuse the situation, and the officer draws her gun.
Arrêtez! Restez où vous êtes!
Get in the car.
He tries to persuade her to just walk away, but she's not interested. As a result, Walker draws his gun, ready to make the tough choice, once again showing the contrast between these two characters. Ethan almost manages to talk the officer down, but not before she is shot by one of Zola's goons.
Zola wants a word with you.
This goon then tells one of the others to finish her off, and Ethan's having none of that. He then goes over to check on the officer, gets her to apply pressure to her wound, and tells her to call it in, before they all pile on into the car and drive off, with Ilsa in pursuit. Now, there's a couple similarities between this scene and the one in Dead Reckoning. We've got Zola's goons about to shoot and kill an innocent, much like Zola's goon about to shoot and kill Grace. but in one, the tension is diffused in perhaps the most unsatisfying way possible, through sheer dumb luck. Whereas in Fallout, Ethan finds himself in a situation where he's forced to make an incredibly difficult yet interesting choice to diffuse the tension. He successfully subverts Zola's plan, preventing any civilian casualties in the prior chase sequence, making things incredibly difficult for himself in the process. And just as the tension is lifted and the action seems to conclude, his principles are immediately challenged to the fullest extent. If he allows Zola's goons to kill the cop, he ensures the successful extraction of Lane, but if he chooses to kill the goons and save the cop, he risks burning bridges with the White Widow, ruining his chances of obtaining the plutonium and ultimately endangering the mission. In what is a great test of his character, the film asks how far Ethan will go to protect the innocent, and Ethan answers by killing the goons without hesitation, because to him, it is worth saving this one innocent life, regardless of the potential consequences. As far as the midpoint between action scenes go, this one is skillfully executed. As is the trend in Fallout, our characters are positioned in a way that requires an interesting choice to be made in order for them to escape a problematic situation. This effortlessly draws the audience into an incredibly tense moment that plays out in an almost unpredictable fashion. Now, it's probably worth noting that odds and luck play a factor in both of these scenes. Fallout relies on the police officer being in the wrong place at the wrong time and subsequently spotting the team trying to escape with Lane. It's unlucky and it puts them in an unfavorable situation, but it doesn't exist outside the realm of possibility. As for Dead Reckoning, the sheer likelihood of the events we see playing out in the way they do is inconceivable. And the luck that both Ethan and Grace have can be put down to nothing other than plot armor. Now, you may argue that Ethan similarly gets incredibly lucky in the final act in Fallout when he crashes his chopper into walkers. And you wouldn't be wrong, but the fact of the matter is that Ethan needed the detonator. Time was running out, and he had exhausted all other options at that stage. So this was his only way forward. Yet in Dead Reckoning, this wasn't the only option Ethan had. Yes, it was the only option he had to save Grace, but like I've said 100 times at this point, Ethan cannot know Grace needs saving. So in his mind, he decides to smash through one of the many windows on the train for no real reason and finds himself exactly where he needs to be, saving Grace in the process. It's the perfect thing he needed to do when he had no idea it needed doing. You might also argue that Ethan's earlier line,
I see the train! I don't think I'm gonna make it!
implies that he isn't going to be able to land on top of the train. And so smashing in through the window was his only option. Yet this still doesn't account for the fact that he gets unfathomably lucky in his choice of window. In Fallout, we see Ethan's decision making at play. We as the viewer can see that the choice he makes is really the only option he has, however risky it may be. But in Dead Reckoning, if we were to believe this was his only option, the only thing that informs the audience of this is his line,
I don't think I'm gonna make it!
We don't ever see what his approach actually looks like, and whether this was the right thing or only thing for him to do in this situation. The fact of the matter is that he still got far luckier in this scenario than the one in Fallout, and does so completely by accident. Saving Grace wasn't on his mind when he makes this decision. He's just trying to get on the train. Whereas in Fallout, he makes the decision to crash the helicopter solely because he knows he needs to get his hands on the detonator. He doesn't know he needs to save Grace in Dead Reckoning, so the fact that he does is just inexplicably lucky. From a writing standpoint, it's far more rewarding to see our characters in situations that go wrong rather than right, as we then get to see how they navigate the situation by making intelligent and consistent character decisions. In Fallout, things go wrong on a regular basis, whether it's this scene, the Halo jump, or the final set piece, and it's so captivating watching our characters figure out the best course of action in these scenarios. Yet in Dead Reckoning, our protagonists are given an easy out that relies on unfathomable luck in the face of insurmountable odds. Everything that could possibly go their way does, in a sequence of events that couldn't be more unrealistic. It's just simply not enjoyable or satisfying to watch. Fallout demonstrates how the aftermath of an action sequence can have so much potential, showcasing tests of character and incorporating overarching themes whilst maintaining plot integrity and not straying too far outside the realms of possibility. By doing so, it successfully builds tension that is relieved by our characters making consistent choices in line with their principles, which allows for satisfying payoffs. On the other hand, Dead Reckoning completely disregards these possibilities and rather hopes that the spectacle of the stunt is enough to justify what follows. From start to finish, the Dead Reckoning stunt is a complete shit show. It's terribly constructed, built on a foundation of contrivances, incomprehensible luck, and lackluster writing that exist beyond the borders of realism. The drama lacks meaningful tension or suspense, and comes about in a rather unnatural and illogical fashion. Most regrettably, the stunt does nothing to service the characters or the themes of the film, and honestly damages their competency. It's a major fall from grace when compared to the film's predecessor, Fallout, where the stunts and action scenes were not only exciting, but they had simple setups and skillfully wove intriguing themes and character progression throughout. For a film handled by the same creative team, there's no reason they couldn't replicate something similar for Dead Reckoning. Yet the bike stunt and most of the action in the film falls so short of what McQuarrie and Cruise were able to achieve in Fallout. At its core, the stunt fails because it simply just doesn't have a good enough reason to be in the film. The events unfold in such an artificial fashion to force the stunt into the film, and you can feel it. There's no real meaningful reason for its existence beyond sheer spectacle, and it even fails in that regard. In my opinion, it's one of the most underwhelming moments in Mission Impossible history, and perhaps the most ridiculous. The stunt itself is a perfect representation of the film as a whole, and the next film is going to have to do a lot of work to try and salvage anything from this train wreck. Hopefully McQuarrie and Cruise can bring back some of the magic that made Fallout such a smash hit success. Prioritizing the character and story writing whilst constructing stunts that occur naturally needs to be at the forefront of their process, but I can't help but feel that the cracks in their filmmaking approach have begun to show, with this project showcasing that their methods may not be as solid as they believe. They simply bit off more than they could chew, and the final product couldn't be more telling. I hope they can turn things around in Mission Impossible 8, but judging by the ballooning budget, on-set malfunctions, and the fact that they've been locked in with the story as both films were shot at the same time, I don't have high hopes. That's without even mentioning that they may not even be aware of where this one went wrong due to the positive critical and audience reception that the film garnered. So it seems unlikely that they have or will make any changes to their process. I am curious to find out what might happen in the final reckoning, but if it's anything like Dead Reckoning, I fear we may be in for another stinker, and that's a real shame. We'll just have to wait and see. But after watching this film over and over and over again for the sake of this video, I can say one thing's for certain.